The iPhone XR was released back in September of 2018 as a budget iPhone alongside the iPhone XS and XS Max. However, just a few months later, this phone outsold its bigger brothers, the iPhone XS and XS Max, and became the best-selling smartphone of 2019 with more than 46 million units sold. So 2 years ago, a lot of people bought these, and I think it's because this phone has pretty much all the features you need in a smartphone with a few but small drawbacks. So let's talk about it and see if it's worth buying in 2021. Let's go. Okay, so when it comes to the design, I think it's pretty good. It looks similar to an iPhone 8, mainly because of the single camera on the back. But unlike the iPhone 8, it has Face ID and no home button. There is glass on both sides of this phone. The back glass has a glossy finish, which I normally don't like because it tends to show a lot of fingerprints, but this white color actually does a great job of hiding most of them. So if you are one of the few people that don't use a case, I think this is the color to go for. The sides of this phone are made from aluminum, which is not as durable as stainless steel, but it still feels and I think looks good too. However, something you might not know is that this phone is IP67 water resistant, not IP68. It's definitely one of the drawbacks, but it's not a deal breaker since IP67 should be more than enough for most people. So overall, the iPhone XR feels like a solid, premium, and well-built phone. However, where in my opinion things get a little more interesting is when it comes to the screen. So the iPhone XR has a 6.1-inch LCD screen with a resolution that's slightly higher than 720p. So at least on paper, this phone has a pretty bad screen. Like, it's not even 1080p and it's not an OLED screen. However, if you actually use this phone, you'll immediately realize that the LCD screen in this phone is nowhere as bad as it seems, but it's still not as good as an OLED. So I think the screen is the biggest drawback in this phone. However, that being said, I think for an average user who's not a tech head like one of my friends, this screen should be more than enough because the viewing angles are not terrible. It's got a good amount of contrast. It looks fairly color accurate and sharp. It gets plenty bright, so using it outdoors shouldn't be a problem. And it gets dark enough to be comfortably used at night. Honestly, what's more noticeable than the screen resolution are the slightly thicker bezels around the screen when compared to maybe an iPhone XS. But you get used to it after a while and it's a lot less noticeable if you use a case. So nothing to really worry about, just thought I'd mention it. So this phone really doesn't have a bad screen and I don't think you'll be disappointed by it. Now, just like the iPhone XS and XS Max, the iPhone XR is also running Apple's A12 Bionic processor, and I think that means this phone will be getting all the new features in iOS 15. So although some of the older iPhones like the iPhone 7 and 8 are also getting iOS 15, they won't actually be getting all the new features, for example, live text. So it's nice to know that this phone will. However, unlike the iPhone XS and XS Max, this phone has not 4 but 3 gigs of RAM, which is another small weakness of this phone. So occasionally, this phone may struggle to keep some apps open in the background. But when it comes to performance, I personally didn't really notice a difference between the XR and XS. This phone has absolutely no problems performing everyday tasks like calling, texting, browsing, watching YouTube, and things like that. It just flies through pretty much everything. Even when it comes to gaming, this phone has got you covered. I played a few games including Call of Duty, which I think is a graphically intensive game, and this phone handled pretty much everything perfectly. There were no frame drops, no lag, no nothing. So I think it's safe to say that unless you have this phone like right beside an iPhone 12 Pro, it will not and should not feel like a slow phone at all, at least in 2021. But what about the battery life? Well, this phone has a 2942 mAh battery, and you may think that's a small battery for a phone with a 6.1-inch screen. But remember, this phone has a fairly low resolution screen, so the processor in this phone has to process fewer pixels, therefore it consumes less power. So with 91% battery health, I was able to get 6+ hours of screen on time with like 10 to 20% battery remaining by the end of the day. So in my personal opinion, the battery life on the XR is definitely above average. Even if you're gonna play games on this phone, I think you can expect to get at least 5 hours of screen on time, which is great. So I can confidently say that this phone will get you through your day on a single charge as long as your iPhone XR has at least 80% battery health. Finally, let's take a look at the cameras. So this phone has 2 cameras, one on the front and one on the back. On the back, there's a 12 megapixel standard wide-angle camera. You can shoot up to 4K at 60 frames per second and 1080p at 240 frames per second. I think photos and videos from this camera look really good. It has the same primary sensor as the iPhone XS and XS Max. However, it doesn't have a telephoto camera, but honestly, in my opinion, that's a very small drawback. If you think about it, a 2x telephoto camera is used for optical zoom and portrait photos, but you can achieve similar results just by digitally cropping in. Sure, the photos might not be as sharp, but if removing the telephoto camera means the phone will be cheaper, I think it's worth it. Plus, I barely use the telephoto camera on my phone. I would much rather have an ultra-wide angle camera. So no telephoto camera is not a big deal, and yes, the iPhone XR also has portrait mode and it works very well. But unfortunately, this phone doesn't have night mode, and in 2021, that definitely can be seen as a major drawback. But to be fair, when this phone was released, none of the iPhones had night mode, even the iPhone XS. So I don't know. I guess I'll leave this one for you to decide. The selfie camera is also pretty good. I think it's good enough for most video calls and selfies and pretty much everything you would use a selfie camera for. But here's the most important question. Is the iPhone XR worth buying with all those drawbacks? Well, my answer is yes. However, I wouldn't recommend you to buy this phone brand new because it costs almost 700 Canadian dollars. You add a little more money and you can get yourself an iPhone 11 Pro in the used market. So there you have it. The iPhone XR is a great phone with a few drawbacks, but considering the price you can find it for in the used market, I recommend it. And that's all for this video. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you later.